All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. We're so happy to have you all here today. I'm Kayla Nichols, Communications Director for Pesticide Action Network North America, or PAN for short. Today, you'll be hearing mostly from our Communications Manager, Rob Fox, about how he uses the principles of agroecology on his farm, Genuine Fox Farm in Tripoli, Iowa, with his partner, Tammy. But before I turn it over to Rob, I'd like to explain a bit more about PAN and what we do. At PAN, we work to create a just, healthy, and equitable food system. We believe that for too long, pesticide and biotech corporations have dictated how we grow food, placing the health and economic burdens of pesticide use on farmers, farm workers, and rural communities. PAN works with those on the front lines to tackle the pesticide problem and reclaim the future of farming. We were founded in 1982 and have worked since then to end the reliance on hazardous pesticides and achieve health, resilience, and justice in food and farming. We use grassroots science, strategic communications, and coalition organizing to build power with communities across the US and around the world to confront the harms of industrial ag and build solutions. We are one of 5 regional centers who cooperate to transform systems of food and farming around the globe. PAN's office is headquartered in Berkeley, California, but our staff is spread across different parts of the US. I'm based in Central Appalachia in Northeast Tennessee. Rob, as we mentioned, is in the Midwest in Iowa. And our digital production manager, Andrew Olson, who is also on the webinar today to help us troubleshoot any technical issues, is based in Florida. We want to let you know that we are recording this webinar and we'll send out a link of the recording to everyone who registered. We will have time for Q&A after Rob's presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use to drop those in the Q&A function to ensure that we see them, because questions can get lost in the chat. And also, if you have joined today, we'd love to hear where you're from. So if you want to drop that in the chat as we get started today, we'll watch those come in. We love to see where everyone's joining from. So with that, I will turn it over to Rob.
Thank you, Kayla. It's good to be able to do this. Agroecology is one of my favorite topics that people at PAN know all too well. I like to write about it. I like to talk about it. And it's a pleasure to be able to share with all of you today. I wanted to start with a slide about Pesticide Action Network so you all could kind of see some of the things that we do. And you can see that there's a picture with some of our staff there at a gathering where we had other folks who are leaders in agroecology at a gathering in California. We are an organization that uses grassroots science, coalition organizing, and strategic communications to do our work. And I'm sure you can read the rest, and some of this would be a duplication of what Kayla has said, but sometimes it's nice to have the chance to read things. But I thought I would do that first, and then I would introduce you to me. You probably noticed my last name is spelled F-A-U-X. Those of you that know about French will know that that is also false in French. So we're essentially the genuine fake farm, if you will. And in Iowa, there's a reason for using that name. Not only is it our last name, but in Iowa, a typical farm would be hundreds, if not thousands of acres in size. And our farm is 15 acres in size. So it's a small farm. And it's a small scale diversified farm, which means we do not grow just 1 or 2 crops. We grow a very wide variety of vegetables, including poultry and fruit trees, among other things. We were established in 2004 and reached our peak size in 2007 and kept that size until recently, 2020. And when the pandemic hit, there were some things that happened that encouraged us to look at doing things differently. And we've scaled back a little bit. And at that point in time, I took a job with Pesticide Action Network as well. So this is my full-time off-farm job, but we do continue to run the farm at a slightly scaled back level. During our peak years, our farm could produce 15 tons of food annually. So think about that. A 15-acre farm is producing 15 tons of food on an annual basis for the local community to consume. And I want to put that in your back pocket to think about or hold that fact as we talk about some of the ways that agroecology can actually bring us to a situation where we can feed the world successfully. We have been certified organic, but then when we started to scale back, we stopped doing the certification, even though we follow all the organic certification processes. And we do sell to local markets. We have changed to only doing direct to consumer, and then excess goes to the food bank at this point in time. And that's one of the privileges I have for having a job off the farm, is that we can produce food and we can afford to put it into the food bank system so that people who can't afford food can get good quality food. Let's go to the next one. Let's go to agroecology. Most of my slides will not have words. Most of my slides will have pictures. But I wanted to make sure that you had some idea of some of the key things that I think embody what agroecology is. So you could call this our nutshell for the day. Agroecology is a combination of things that have been and things that will be, if you will. Some of the things that my ancestors from Ireland knew about raising potatoes, for example, would be in my heritage, just as the three sisters in some of the Native American tribes might be. So our heritage is part of what comes into this, but then the new sciences can be combined in our agroecology to help us to do better with raising food and better with the things that we do on the land. Agroecology is a combination of agriculture, ecology, community. We don't isolate one from the other. So if you're working to have a farm, that farm has direct connections with the community around it. It's not just an isolated business that goes about its own thing and doesn't have any kind of interactions whatsoever. Obviously, there has to be some recognition of economics, and agroecology is a set of principles that promote sustainability and resilience. But maybe some of the biggest things I want you to walk away here with is, number one, agroecology embraces complexity. And this is why this is so difficult to promote agroecology, is because agroecology is in itself complexity. It's not simplicity. It doesn't promote a one-size-fits-all situation, which means that the things I talk to you about today are things that work on my farm. And if you have somebody else who is farming somewhere else in the world, they could take the idea, but they might have to modify it to fit their farm, because the world is a complex place and we can't necessarily make the same process or principle work exactly the same way somewhere else. My neighbor, who lives a half-mile away, also uses the principles of agroecology, and you will find many similarities, but you will also find many differences between the two of us. Another thing that I want you to walk away here with is the bottom point. Agroecology encourages us to adapt our agriculture to the land, not the other way around. And what we do currently in our world is we tend to spend an awful lot of time adapting the land to our agriculture. And that is putting us into a situation where we are not going to be resilient. We are not going to be sustainable. Eventually, this is going to catch up to us. On the other hand, if we adapt our agriculture to the land and what the land is telling us, I think we will find we'll have long-term success. So I'm going to take you back in time. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. The story has to do with the land around our farm. And our farm is right in the middle. You kind of see a five-sided piece of land in there, and that's where our farm currently is in 1930. But I want you to just absorb what this looks like. This is an aerial view of the area around our farm. This is the first aerial survey of Iowa that was taken, and it has been pieced together so that people like me can actually see what things look like. You've maybe heard the word patchwork for a description of what fields in the Midwest of the United States might look like. And this truly fits that. There's a lot of fields with different textures, and those textures tell us that they're growing different crops in each of these different fields. And you'll notice that we have some wild areas. We've got a few farmsteads. Let me go ahead and go to the next one and show you what I'm talking about. I have put some red around a few areas I want you to notice before we go and fast forward to the future. Up in the top center, you'll notice there's a pasture area, probably perennial grasses. There are trees and bushes there. And that's what that area was used for many years. In fact, I can go forward in time and see images from up to 1960 where that area is still trees and pasture. Down at the bottom, you'll notice that there is a field that has a farmstead in the middle, and it's basically got stripes showing you all kinds of different crops. And for the most part, I could tell you that that looks to me like almost a 7-year rotation of crops. They didn't grow the same thing in the same spot year after year. They would move them to a different field as the years went by. And then on the right, you'll notice there's some area with trees that isn't been tilled up. It's a wild space. I just want you to keep an eye on those as we go forward in time. So this is 2018. And I want you to notice at the top that some of that area that was trees and permanent or perennial grasses has now been tilled up. And in fact, you can go back to about 1965 with the images, and that's about the time they decided to till that area under. You'll notice on the bottom, that field that was stripes of many fields, it's now one big field. And that field, in fact, has been planted as corn every year for the last 6 years. We've just been watching, and that's what they've been doing is corn, 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 corn every year. Same crop, the whole field. And then over on the right, there was an area that was trees and perennials, and you'll notice that that has also been tilled. And I want you to take a really good look at that one on the right, and you'll notice that there looks like there's a line that runs through that. That's actually an area that sometimes becomes a little bit of a waterway. And that waterway is simply tilled through at this point in time. So if it rains really hard, lots of water is going to go through that, and that will cause erosion. So I'm going to go back to 1930 again. We're bouncing back and forth in time. And I want you to notice the green areas. Those are all farmsteads that are just in this particular image. Take a note about how big they are, about how much space each one of them covers, because the main farmstead areas where there might be some trees, a woodlot, a pastured area for animals, maybe some orchard trees, probably the farm's garden to keep everybody up with food for the winter, and any number of things, probably also buildings. So that's what it looked like in 1930. You'll notice that there's a farmstead on the bottom right. Now I'm going to go forward in time again, and I left circles where there were farmsteads. You'll notice that 2 of them are completely gone. All the others have been tilled much closer to their buildings, or buildings have been taken down. And the only one that actually has green space that has grown is the one in the center. And that's our farm. And it's kind of interesting to note that our farm is actually used by people who are learning how to fly small planes. We're actually a point where they are told, well, to navigate, go find that little farm that's still green in October or green in March, and then you can turn right or left or whichever way they're supposed to go. So apparently we stand out. So here's another point I want you to see. Do you notice, if you look, that the soil has different colors? And you'll notice the soil doesn't have those colors following the fence lines. They're not squares, they're not rectangles. The soil has different qualities. The land has different qualities and different characteristics that are telling us that there are different ways that make more sense for them to be. Maybe they need to be wild spaces. Maybe they're better for growing a different crop. Maybe they need to be a pasture. But those areas that are light up there in the first top arrow, that's an area that's very sandy. And every time I see it get tilled in the spring, if we have any wind, you have all kinds of soil blowing around. Lots of wind erosion up there. And if you look down at the second arrow that comes down by our farm, you'll notice there's a pale area that comes down into our farm. Soil types are different. Soil types tend to support different kinds of life. And I know that my soil type on my farm changes. So I actually do some different things, even on my 15 acres. I recognize there's differences in the soil. The land is telling me to do different things. So I adapt what I do so I can fit what I know about the land as I learn it. And here's a picture of our farm. You'll notice that on the right-hand side, that's where a lot of our vegetable production is. I've got 7 plots over there. All of them are 200-foot long by 60-foot wide, and that creates for us an easy 7-year rotation. So I'm not growing the same thing in each plot every year. And all I have to do is move the things that I was growing in the top plot down one, and the one at the bottom rolls up to the top. It's a pretty simple process. But creating that particular rotation took a lot of thought, and we can talk about that more later. So now you can see I've got some pasture area, I've got areas for buildings, I've got a couple of hoop buildings that I can grow in and extend my season. And of course, there are trees and some other wild spaces along the edges. You might notice that I'm trying to grow along the edges because the fields next to me are all corn and soybeans. So we are kind of an island in the middle of it all, doing things a little bit differently. So let's get you down on the ground so you can see some interesting things, see some beautiful pictures. One of the things that agroecology is all about is putting more diversity in our growing systems. And this is one of the mechanical ways that you can use agroecological principles. It's by adding diversity intentionally into your growing systems. So what you see here is you see one of those plots on the east, and there are 3 rows of cucumbers, and next to it to the right is a row of peas. They're trellised. And then in between that, there is some carrots just on the other side of the peas, and then another row of peas, and then more cucumbers. And eventually, on the outsides of this particular plot, we would have pole beans growing there. So let me talk about why this is so useful from many perspectives. First of all, one of the things that you have trouble with in Iowa anyway with cucumbers is the cucumber beetle. It's aptly named. It will cause problems with your cucumber plants. But one of the best things that you can do, aside from spraying pesticides, is to promote areas where things like cucumbers, like the leopard frog, or like leopard frogs, like you see on the bottom right, or snakes, or various other predators. If you have habitat for them, then they're going to have a place for them to be. Peas get started earlier, which means I'm creating a space where the frogs like to be. And then as I plant the cucumbers in later, the frogs are already there. I already have services from nature to help protect me as far as that's considered. And then the carrots on the other side, they're between 2 trellised rows of peas. One of the problems we have is that deer love carrots, but I already have 2 fences, and all I have to do is put something across the 2 ends, and I'm protecting my carrots from the deer. So there are practical things that I can do with diversity, and then there are things that I can do where I'm encouraging natural services to be on hand, so I don't have to rely on pesticides here. I'm relying on the natural services to keep my pest pressure under control so that I can have good cucumber, pea, carrot, and pole bean harvests. All of those come out of the same field. So more diversity in growing systems is a good thing. Okay, so I get this question a lot. Can one small farm actually make a difference? And this is where I want you to grab onto some hope. This picture is hard to see, but if you look at the smudges in the sky, those are all dragonflies. And dragonflies are wonderful predators. They'll eat practically anything. And when I first moved onto this farm in 2004, and this, Pierre, is actually going to connect to your question about organic certification. When we moved here in 2004, the land around us was all corn and soybeans, including some of the land that we currently farm. And we did not notice any dragonflies on the farm at all for the first 6 to 7 years we were on the farm. But eventually we started getting hatchings of dragonflies. And this picture is from just a couple of years ago, where we had a hatching of dragonflies. And I would say we had somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple hundred dragonflies on our farm. So can one small farm make a difference? The dragonflies say, yes, it can. By doing things to have wild spaces and diversity on our farm, we can actually create a space where the dragonflies are an indicator that our environment on our farm is balancing out. And Pierre, you asked the question about keeping organic certification with the neighbors we have, because yes, you noticed we have corn and soybeans surrounding us. We're an island. And the answer to that question is Certainly, if we have evidence of drift, then that can actually cause problems with organic certification. And that's an issue we've had to deal with. But what I do want to point out is even if I have that issue with organic certification, there is still evidence that all of the things that I am doing are having a positive impact. So rather than focusing on my specific issue that I'm surrounded by corn and soybeans, the point I want you to walk away here with is that small farms, if we can get them started and we can support them, they're going to have an opportunity to make differences anywhere they are. And could you imagine if we had clusters of these farms, if they could work together so they could help protect themselves from some of the large chemical intensive agriculture? Imagine the kind of ecosystems we could build just with a few clusters of farms this size. This is a reminder, our farm could produce 15 tons of food, and it's not just one thing. It's not just corn, it's not just soybeans, it's a whole host of vegetables. It includes poultry, it includes apples. It's a fair amount of food, and it can feed an awful lot of people. So once again, imagine if we could have clusters of small scale diversified farms throughout the world, how well we could feed things. So let's go back to that embracing complexity thing. Okay, we've got here. And in this plot, we have two cash crops actually. No, I guess we have one. We have winter squash in here. And that's my cash crop. That's my food crop. The additional things that I have planted here are sunflowers on the left, zinnias on the left, borage on the right, and then what you can't see in the middle is nasturtium flowers. So one of the things we do on our farm is we plant other plants that aren't necessarily a cash generating crop, if you will, but we plant them for the complexity and the diversity that actually encourages better production from my cash crop and encourages health in my system, in my ecosystem. So we introduce diversity in all kinds of ways. We do the longer, more complex crop rotations. And I noticed Denise is saying, it's disheartening to have all the monocultural farms around us. And I agree. It's kind of sad to see a neighbor growing corn year after year in such a large field. It's destroying their soil. It's destroying their ecosystem slowly over time as they continue to do this. And we do talk to those neighbors. Some neighbors are more willing to talk to us than other. In fact, the neighbor in the area I'm talking about has a great deal of curiosity for what we do and is frankly kind of confused by what we do, which I actually welcome. Because if they're confused and they're willing to ask questions, then there's an opportunity for them to start adapting changes. And one of the fields I did not point out to you, just to help you out a little bit and show you that there is some hope. One of the fields that had been taken to our east, that had been taken out of woodland and pasture, had been tilled up for many years. But then 3 years ago, the owner of that land chose to take a chunk of 50 acres out of production and put in a perennial pollinator planting. And they love it. They think it's wonderful. I love it because the number of pollinators on my farm, even though this is about 3/4 of a mile away, the pollinators on my farm actually increased because there was another area not so far away that was also supporting pollinators. So is there a chance to convert people? Of course, there's always a chance. I think a lot of people who are farmers are folks who do have some love for the land, but it's being suppressed. And I think that if we have more and more examples, we talk about this more often, I think we're going to see that there can be some change over time. All right, so you see some different ways for introducing diversity. I've got a sunflower there because it's pretty, and I've got a picture of buckwheat on the bottom left. And buckwheat is a crop that we sometimes plant as a cover crop. And this cover crop we use partly for the pollinators because bees love these things, but we also use them as an herbicide, believe it or not. We have a weed called Canadian thistle that's nasty on the farm. And we have learned that if you do a couple of sessions of buckwheat in an area where you have Canadian thistle, which is a perennial weed, The buckwheat will suppress the Canadian thistle, and you won't have necessarily too much problem with Canadian thistle for a couple of years after that. So we can usually suppress them. And if we really want to take the Canadian thistle out, we could take that field out of production for a while and continue with the cover crops until the Canadian thistle is gone. So that no herbicides, no pesticides involved, just another living plant, a different living system is actually doing something to balance out the illness that was in that field, which was a very invasive weed. So another thing we do is intercropping. You've already seen it twice in this presentation, but here's another example of it. I've got some sweet corn, I've got some flowers, and I've got some pumpkins in this particular picture. And the whole idea of intercropping is that you're intentionally adding plant diversity within your growing system. So some of my neighbors, for example, could say, hey, I've noticed that parts of my land does not produce as well as others because the soil isn't as good. Well, I know some farmers, some large scale farmers, are starting to do something where they're putting in pollinator strips in their farm. They're taking areas out of production that have produced poorly anyway, and they're putting pollinator areas in there. Uh, is this the best perfect solution in the world? Of course not, but sometimes you have to make steps in the direction you want to go. And this is one of those steps. Another farmer I know has taken the edges of their fields out of production and put them into perennial grasses, which is another thing that they can do that can be helpful to both the environment, their own farm's health, and the health of the soil. All good things to do. Here's another example of another intercropping field, but also this is a field that kind of helps me explain crop rotations. This particular field's got broccoli and cauliflower and onions in it, so different kinds of brassica and then different kinds of allia. And that crop rotation is useful because brassica, like broccoli and cauliflower, they don't like cabbage butterflies and cabbage loopers, because who wants to get a broccoli plant or a broccoli head, take a bite out of it and have half a worm in there? That's where those green worms come from, is those cabbage loopers and those cabbage butterflies. Those are their larvae. And they do like those plants. So if I grow one large field of just broccoli, it's like I'm saying, okay, cabbage loopers and cabbage butterflies, here's your smorgasbord, come eat. But if I break that up with some diversity, then it's less apparent to them that that's where they need to go. So once again, if I go monocrop, I'm asking to have to use pesticides to control the critters that are normally going to go there, because you've just planted something they want to eat, of course. But now if I plant onions with my brassica, we have noticed over time, and with some various other research, that algae tend to either mask or repel some of the cabbage butterflies or cabbage loopers. We will get a few, but we don't get very many. And so we have decided to intercrop those things. But going back to the crop rotation, one of the things that you need to know if you grow certain crops is they have particular diseases. They also have particular needs as far as the soil is concerned. So they will take up certain nutrients more than others. And if you keep growing in the same location, the same crop, then you're going to build up all kinds of issues with pests and diseases, and you're going to be left with only one solution, and that's using more pesticides to try and control losses that come from those particular problems. So one of the solutions is don't grow those crops in the same place year after year. That's why a longer crop rotation actually helps you. It helps the soil recover from crops that are a little bit more greedy for nutrients. It helps the farmer a little bit by giving diversity to its production, so that now I have built my own insurance into the production, because if one year my broccoli doesn't do well, I'll still have onions. I'm still getting a cash crop. If you grow one crop and have a bad year for that crop, then you have a problem. But if you grow lots of crops, then you have just basically spread out your possibility of losses so that you have taken charge on your own farm to make sure that you have your own insurance, which is one of the things I love to try and encourage people to think about. Another thing that we do is we also integrate animals into our system. Now, of course, you have to be aware of food safety. You want to make sure that you don't introduce manure into crops you're about to harvest and you're trying to give to people. So you have to worry about food safety. But at the same time, if we have animals in our system, we do create fertility options. And one of the things that I can do is if I have a field that is done for the year, I can put poultry on that field and let them clean it up, and then they can be portable manure spreaders for me. Far better than putting them in a container and then having to scoop all of that out and spread it myself. I might as well let the animals do the spreading for me. But we can also create areas with clovers and perennial clovers and grasses that are good pastures for these animals. What you see up above in the image is you see that there's a portable building. We move that building roughly every other day because the birds do sleep in it at night. And then when it gets sunny, they use that for shelter. So, of course, the area that's going to get the most concentration of stress for the ground is going to be where the building is. We have a poultry netting around them, which is electrified with a solar charger that protects them from potential predators and also keeps them where we want them so they don't get into the vegetable crops that are a little bit further away. Um, but this is one way that we can keep them out. When we do what's called day ranging with our birds, we like to let them out during the day. They can go where they want within the fenced area, and then at night we get them to go in the building so that the local owl, does not come and feast on our birds. We also raise turkeys. I thought this was a neat picture, so I just thought I'd share it. We have a flock of turkeys. Once again, they're day ranged. We give them a nice big area to work. And there's a nice big willow tree in the corner of their pasture that they like to go hang out around. So we try to give our animals a good place to be. We give them a good environment to be. We don't overcrowd them, and we treat them as well as we can. So here's agroecology as far as nature is concerned. One of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to realize that nature has all kinds of support for us that we can actually tap into. We do not have to rely on pesticides or even our own innovations sometimes to actually make things work for us. So, for example, you'll notice a couple of pictures. I've got a green bee on the bottom right on goldenrod, and then we've got some thousand flower asters with a honeybee on it. We do have areas on our farm where we let the clover go, and a lot of folks are tempted to mow any place that looks like it should be a lawn, but we have this tendency to, if we've got clover growing, we tend to watch their bloom cycle. And once the bloom cycle gets past peak, that picture on the top right is just past peak a little bit. About a week after this picture, I would mow that to try and encourage it to come up with another bloom during the season. So we're watching even areas that some people would call lawn, and we're trying to make that work for us as well and trying to pay attention to what's going on. We think about soil health all the time on the farm. We try to reduce our tillage. There are two things that I think we all need to keep in mind when it comes to agriculture. The more we till, the harder it is on the organisms in the soil and the structure of the soil. The more we use pesticides, the harder it is on the organisms in the soil and on the structure of the soil. And a lot of our monocropping systems do both incessantly. A lot of folks like to say that pesticides are a way that we can avoid over tilling or overturning the soil too much. But what my observation has been, at least in Iowa, is there's an awful lot of recreational tillage, is what I like to call it, that goes on every year that doesn't have to happen. And then they still make multiple passes applying fungicides, herbicides, and insecticides. And so they're not really following that principle in the first place. So they're doing double duty to destroy soil health. In our case, we're trying to limit the damage we can do on all cases. So we try to limit our tillage. We try to do things like cover the soil with alternatives, like you see some paper mulch in this picture, or we'll use straw mulch. So sometimes we use mulching systems to cover the soil, prevent erosion, and maintain soil health. We think a lot about water on our farm. We happen to be in an area where water is typically not a big issue. but we still don't want to waste the water. So you'll notice that we're running drip irrigation systems on our farm rather than an overhead system. Uh, Everybody's system is going to be different potentially depending on your soils, depending on the tools you have. But this is what we are currently using on our farm. And the idea is we're trying to deliver the water where the crop is. So here's one of my biggest lines that I want you to walk away with as far as our farm is concerned. We feel a field is successful when it's one we want to be in. The field you're looking at has watermelons, buckwheat, melons, zinnias, borage, calendula, sun hemp, which is a cover crop. But essentially, it's just got a lot of diversity in it, and it's all green. It's just a mat of green, and it's beautiful. The pollinators in here are amazing. The diversity of life in here is amazing. And so this is a field I want to be in. This was actually an experimental field the year that we did this. I believe it was 2015 or 2014. And the idea is we were going to cut back the number of melon and watermelon plants that we were growing by 1/3 and replace that with flowering plants. And we were going to treat them as crops, just like we did the melons and watermelons. We kind of expected that we would probably see a reduction in melons because, well, you planted 1/3 fewer plants. Of course, you'll have fewer. What ended up happening is we got 30% more melon production, marketable melons with this field. We planted 30% less, we got 30% more production by introducing excellent pollinator space that encouraged the pollinators to be there even before the melons needed them. See, we make this mistake thinking that if we plant something, eventually the pollinators will find it. And as humans, we think they'll find it the next day. Whenever the first flower opens, pollinators will be there. But it takes a while for pollinators to recognize an opportunity. So if you create the opportunity before the point you actually need them in your field, then you're more likely to have more pollinators. So this was one of my best fields that I wanted to be in. And we were able to replicate that year after year. So it wasn't a one-year gig. We did it every year. Here's an example of some inherited knowledge with science. This is one of those hoop buildings. It's called a high tunnel. And you'll notice we've got lots of diversity inside of this. We've got tomatoes, carrots, beets, onions, melons, peppers, beans, wide range of diversity. But the idea of growing undercover, it's a little relatively modern concept. I know you can go back into the 1800s and find orangeries, for example, that do the same thing. But this is something that's been promoted, and just want to show you that we do use this kind of thing. The problem with high tunnels, though, is they cover the soil, and eventually the soil is going to get weaker. So we went ahead and expended the effort to create a high tunnel that moves every year, so that every year we alternate the chunk of land that we're growing under cover. This will allow the natural cycles of snow, sun, rain, soil freezing and unfreezing to occur, which helps keep that soil that we will grow in, it helps keep it healthy. And this is one of the things I want you to think about as you think about agroecology, is you're thinking about the health of the soil, the health of the land, and it doesn't always do the simplest solution, because that's not always, and it's almost never the best solution to have a long-term healthy situation with your environment. Here's an example of adapting and learning. We've got a tool there that's called a flex time harrow, and we had trouble keeping the weeds out of our onions. We figured out how to use this tool. And then, of course, we did pretty well with our onions after that. So this is just a reminder that in agroecology, there's a lot of adaptation and learning. That's part of what comes with complexity and comes with diversity, is there has to be a willingness to observe and learn and change. Here's another example of learning and changing. We did experiments with cover crops, and since in Iowa we tend to get cold and things freeze, we wanted to see if we did some fall cover crops, how that impacted holding the soil to prevent erosion, how it helped the soil health, and how things worked the following year. So there's 4 things we actually tried to do, and actually liked how all 4 of them performed, but we actually liked it better when we started doing mixes of these things instead of just one kind. So once again, diversity is there for the win. Okay, there it is again. Adapt agriculture to the land, not adapt the land to our agriculture. And I want to point at something out on this slide to you. What you're seeing on the bottom right is a slightly musical cone head. It's in the same family as katydids. And as growers, it's very natural to feel protective of the things that you spent time putting in the ground or starting seedlings and putting them in the ground, and you're protecting them and trying to get them to grow and get a good harvest. And so we tend to be reactive when it comes to seeing insects or critters that we don't understand, and we're afraid that they're going to eat what we have and destroy it. And so the tendency is to make the assumption that anything that we see that we don't understand isn't a ladybug, for example, which we think is good, that they're either on our side or against us. And the reality is this: most of nature really doesn't care much about what we're doing in our yards and gardens or our farms, except for the fact that we often kill them. The conehead is not necessarily a ally or an adversary for our farm. It's really neither. It doesn't cause us any real problems. It doesn't really cause us any benefits. But the simple fact that it exists on our farm is an indicator of ecological health on our farm. And that's why I welcome seeing it, is because it shows diversity in the things that are on our farm. Now, I wanted to make a nod towards the challenges that we have to deal with. Some of the questions have already mentioned that. We have farms around us who are monocrops. They use pesticides heavily. And of course, that's an issue. And in fact, this is one of the reasons I now work for the Pesticide Action Network. I would like to make it more possible for farms like mine to succeed and not just succeed, but to thrive. Our farm, despite everything, has fought for years to survive and frankly succeed. But I would like to be able to tell you that our farm thrives. Our farm is not able to thrive in the current system because of pesticides, because of a changing climate, and all the systems that we have that fail to support agroecological principles. But we can make changes. We can make it so that farms like mine can thrive, not just survive. And that's part of the reason why I work for Pesticide Action Network. I'm hoping to do my part. So it's not just me hoping to thrive, it's so that others, whether it's an indigenous community that wants to reestablish their old foodways, whether it's BIPOC farmers wanting to start their own farms on the smaller farms, I want opportunities for all of us to have this chance to thrive and use the principles of agroecology. This is what we're fighting. We're fighting pesticides, among other things. And I put this slide in here because I wanted you to see the bottom right figure, where 90% of Iowa farmers reported feeling that it's a never-ending technology treadmill. So a prior question asked, well, what about these farmers? Do you think they can change? They already recognize there's a problem. Farmers already recognize there's a problem, and I think many of them are looking for the opportunity to get off of this treadmill. I think right now we have sold them a situation where they are feeling helpless and hopeless. And so they're only doing what they're doing partly because they want to, of course, feed their families. The exception to this, of course, is if we continue to allow the large farms where they're basically corporations. They don't typically care so much about these things. So we need to work with the family farmers that are at any size, trying to give them an opportunity to see that there are alternatives to this. And we need to build systems that allow them to do things that support agroecology. So Pesticide Action Network did create recently, just I think it was last January, the Pesticides and Climate Change Report. And one of the things we noticed too is that increased use of pesticides is actually promoting climate change, which in return causes us to use more pesticides. So the point is what we need to be doing is we need to be promoting more and more farms using agroecology. And this is one of the best tools we have for addressing climate change. So we do need more clusters of farms our size, or maybe clusters of farms 50 acres in size, but we need more farms adding diversity, and we need more people on the land We need more people with diverse ideas on the lands. And I think we will find things will get better. All right, here's some of the key GFF principles. You've heard them before. Just wanted to make them clear one more time. And I'm just going to do a couple more slides and then we'll open it up to the questions. I see I've got a couple waiting in the queue. Here's a sample of a garlic harvest at our farm. This isn't the whole harvest, but this is a sample of what we do. I bring this up because we often hire college-age workers or high school-age workers, partly because Tammy and I both feel that education is part of what we should be doing as farmers, as people who use agroecology. And our workers always love garlic harvest day because this is the one day you go out there in the morning and you pull all of the garlic in one day. You count them up and put them into piles of 25. And as we put them on the cart, we yell out 25, 50. We keep a running number so we know what the harvest is. And then when the harvest comes in on the carts, we come back and we hang them up to cure in one of our buildings. And this is the one time that our workers always ask to have their pictures taken. There's a community feel when you get people out there doing physical labor together, but doing reasonable physical labor with enough people to do it, with the right tools to do it with. And there's a lot of positivity that comes from this event. And I just wanted to share that with you so you can see that even a small pocket can make a difference for these people. Of course, we have family farm critters on family farm critters or farm supervisors. We call the cats. That's a swarm of bees on the right, and we're trying to do our bit for energy by adding solar onto the farm. And that gets me to the last slide so we can work on some questions. I'm going to take us off of sharing right now so we can focus on questions.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was great. Do you want me to go through and read the questions, or do you just want to answer them as you see in the Q&A?
I think I can get it, and you can just keep me honest to make sure I actually answer them. I think that might be a
Cool.
good way to do it. Yeah.
Sounds good.
And folks, if I don't answer a question well enough, you can always submit another follow-up question and tell me, no, you didn't answer what I wanted you to answer. So we'll go from there. So I see Dolores has a question. Is it possible to have an agroecological farm in a territory surrounded by greenhouses producing flowers for exportation that use pesticides? You know, that is a great question, because we have a tendency to have this feeling that either you can use agroecology or you can't based on your surroundings. My answer, Dolores, is you can use agroecology anywhere you are. You may have more challenges, just like I have more challenges on my farm. I have lots of challenges having large monocrop fields using pesticides near my farm. It's difficult. There are lots of problems with that. And yet, remember, I have made a difference. I remind myself of this every day. Please don't take this as if I am an individual who thinks everything's roses and beautiful all the time. I struggle. There are issues. There are problems. There are days I wonder why I'm doing this. And yet, I have succeeded on a farm that's surrounded by monocrops that use lots of pesticides. So, Dolores, I suspect that if you're in an area where there are lots of greenhouses using lots of pesticides, they're covering the ground with the plastic of the greenhouses, you can find a way to make agroecology make a difference where you are. I think that's probably the best answer I can give there. I noticed that there's a comment. If you create pollinator strips but keep using neonic treated seed on the surrounding crops, you are likely creating a pollinator sink. And that is a really good comment. And this is one of the things that I think sometimes stops us, is that we look at the logical puzzle that comes with it. If I have a farm that grows corn and soybeans and they decide to do a pollinator strip, and then they do attract some pollinators, then they use neonics, of course they're going to kill them. Yep, that's true. However, if you don't provide any opportunities to make any improvements, then nobody's going to make any change and we're all going to give up. And that is not the solution we want. What we want is we want a solution where the farmers start seeing the benefit of doing what they're doing. And then maybe they take the next step and stop using the neonic treated seeds. Here's some good news, at least in the Midwest. There are a number of farmers who are starting to realize that the neonic treated seeds, especially for corn, are not doing anything for their bottom line. They don't really need them. And they're starting to realize that. So once again, if you have a combination of, some of them are using pollinator strips successfully, and they're starting to realize neonics are not necessarily a good thing for their farm anyway, then maybe you have an opportunity to take a next step beyond that. But I agree that there is truth to what you're saying about this being a pollinator sink. But you know what? The alternative is to have no place for pollinators. And I think I'll take the pollinator sink over the no place at this point in time, in hopes that it'll get better. Carolyn's got a good question. What have been some of the economic benefits and challenges for using agroecology? And I'll start with that one. As far as economic benefits are concerned, let's think about the services that I tap into that are natural services. By doing things to promote predators that will eat some of our pests, I am not expending money or other resources to attempt to address potential pest problems. That's not even on my actual monetary balance sheet as far as that's concerned. It's on my overall farm balance sheet because I always do take care of how is my soil health, how's the ecological health, how's the pollinator health. But as far as my monetary balance sheet is concerned, I have taken away an expense that's on almost every other farm in my area, and that's the pesticide expense, because I am using agroecological principles. Now, here's another agroecological principle, the idea of communities and small farms that interact with each other. If you have a farm just down the road, a half mile away, that means I don't need every piece of equipment. We can share. And you know what? There are certain pieces of equipment you use twice a year. And it makes no sense to have to expend the money on that and go through all the depreciation it has, et cetera, when you could potentially share with somebody else. So that's just two examples. There are several others. I could probably do a whole webinar on that part, so we'll not get into too much more of that. But as opportunities for public policy, as far as transition to resilient and sustainable growing practices, that's an excellent question. Again, that's probably a bigger question than we can do a whole lot on right now. But here are some examples that we could do. One of them would be, what if we asked all farms to put in buffer areas around the edges of their fields? As a certified organic grower, I am required to have areas around the edges of my fields that are buffer strips where I'm not going to grow my organic crops, because we recognize that there could be contamination coming in from a neighboring area. Well, I'm required to do that because I want to have certified organic crops. But you know what? Maybe it makes sense for all farmers to have buffers around their fields so that they are not infringing on what their neighbors want to be doing. So if their neighbor wants to have a wildlife area, then they're going to have their wildlife area. And the abutting fields should have transitional areas that are buffers on theirs, in recognition that not everybody wants to grow corn and soybeans. Okay, that's just one sample of what we could be doing. Another sample of what we could be doing is we could stop supporting our row crop farming habit with as much of the federal benefits for crop insurance. For example, what did I say our farm does? By the way, there's not a good opportunity for our farm to have crop insurance. There isn't a program that really serves us and hasn't been for years. So if we lost all our crops, there would not be a insurance policy that would pay us for our losses. So I've kind of forced to have my own insurance by having diversity. Well, what if part of the insurance were to enforce that all farms should have diversity in their production, if they wanted to have any kind of support from insurance, federal insurance? Instead of saying we will give you insurance for your monocrop, it's we will give you insurance if you have more diversity. And yes, there are some programs that are starting to address that, but they don't go nearly far enough. They reward farms for having three-year rotations, and that's not enough to really make as much difference as we want. So there's a couple of examples. Let's go on to Nikki's. Can you define agroecology in one sentence? Oh my goodness, Nikki, that's not even fair. Oh, one sentence. You know what? I'm going to fall back on the idea that agroecology is complexity, diversity, and the adaptation of our agriculture to the land. Okay, I'm going to use that as a simple one. But again, it's kind of silly because the whole idea that agroecology is adapting or is embracing complexity. That's why it makes it so hard to put it in one sentence, is because it is an embracing of complex systems and all the diversity that comes with it. But yeah, thank you for the challenge, Nikki. Now I'm going to spend probably the next 3 hours trying to figure out an even better sentence. That's a fun question. Thank you. All right, how to make agroecological production sustainable? Another good question. And I will tell you initially that agroecology by its nature is sustainable. Um, the whole purpose of agroecology is to build resilience and sustainability. That's the whole purpose of it. And one of the ways that you do that, once again, is by having that diversity. That means, let's see if I can give you a more concrete example. In Iowa, we have had years recently where we've had severe drought. But prior to that, we had years where we got far more rain. There was a slide I went past really fast that had lettuce in a bunch of water. So we've gone from way too much rain to way too little rain. And there are certain crops that do poorly in one situation and do poorly and then do well in another situation. Potatoes, for example, hate being too wet. We get a lot of rotting potatoes in the field when we have too much rain. But recently, potatoes have been great because we've been dry. By having this diverse cropping system, even in the most extreme situations, and let me point this out, we were setting records for rainfall one season, and then the next for too much rain, and then we set records for not enough rain the next season. And in both seasons, I still brought in sales because I had crops. If that is not sustainable and resilient, I'm not sure what is, because we have created a system that can handle extremes better than if it was just one crop and I put everything into that one crop. It's a great question. And once again, you guys are asking really good questions that we could create a whole new webinar on. So, but thank you. Those are good questions.
There was one more that was sent in the chat. Is there a limit to how large a farm can be and still utilize agroecology principles?
Oh, now that's another good question. And the answer is, once again, there is no one size fits all answer. Let's think about this in terms of the United States because I'm more familiar with it. If you are in, say, Wisconsin, Wisconsin has a lot of rolling hills, and the areas that you can do annual crop production are often in the valleys between the hills. So it lends itself to a certain size of farm and a certain kind of production. If you move to Montana, for example, and let's say what you're trying to do is you're trying to do grazing and maybe a little bit of small grains or some things like that, then a larger farm is actually necessary to maintain a balance. And so you don't exhaust the soil in one spot or you don't overgraze something. So the answer to the question depends very much on what the land is telling us. We cannot say every farm that is 5,000 acres is evil, because sometimes you need a 5,000 acre farm to maintain the diversity. The only issue that we have with this is more on the community and sociology side, in that people have a lot harder time accessing 5,000 acres to do that kind of farm. There's a reason I have a 15-acre farm. I couldn't buy a 500-acre farm or 150 acres or even 50 acres. I couldn't afford it. This is what I could afford. This is what I could do. So this is part of what agroecology recognizes, is that land access is an issue. And if you need to spend millions of dollars just to get a farm big enough to do that kind of farm and do agroecology principles, then that's kind of where it falls a little bit there. But this is also why small scale and sustainable is good, because it puts more people on the land. We just have to get more people access to enough land to do what they can do.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Those were all great questions. We really appreciate everyone being so engaged and sticking around. We went just a little bit over, but it looks like most people were able to stay on. So we really appreciate you all spending some time with us today. Thank you so much to Rob for all your work on this presentation and what you're trying to do on your farm. Everyone who's still here, stay tuned. We've got more webinars planned for PAN this year. So you're on our newsletter list now since you signed up for this. So stay tuned for the next ones that we've got coming up in the next couple of months. Again, thank you for joining in, and we hope to see you again. Y'all have a great day.